Thank you. Thanks so much, Joyce. I'm going to stand up so that I think you can hear me a little bit better. And I'm so delighted to be here today. When I saw the conference announcement, I thought, I have to be there. I am working on a project related to time. And so I'm delighted that Joyce proposed this, and it's wonderful to be speaking with Joyce and Alma today. So I'm going to be showing some slides, and then I'll be showing the entirety of Vormittagsspuk at the end of my presentation, so you'll have to wait for it. So in 1919, the French artist Francis Picabia performed a remarkable action. Visiting the Zurich Dadaists for the first time, he amazed them by attacking an alarm clock in his hotel room with a hammer, smashing it to bits and pieces until he could open up its casing and access its innards of cogs and wheels. And we have, in fact, the evidence of it on the very poster. I was delighted to see that. Then, without hesitating, he poured out some of the contents of an inkwell and dipped the clock bits into the black liquid, pressing them on a sheet of white paper so that they formed a new geometric and non-functional configuration, as we see here. This work, a production of destruction, if you will, he called simply réveil matin, or alarm clock in French. But the surprising kind of awakening that he configured by destroying the wind-up clock was hardly an expected one. His decisively violent action quickly became legendary within the Dada circle, and the resulting original method of printmaking, with the inked clock parts, soon occupied the cover of one issue of Tristan Tzara's journal Dada. 2 years later, Tzara chose to memorialize Picabia's action by having Man Ray take his portrait with an alarm clock hung next to an axe. So I hope you can see that here. It's a little bit dim at the top of the photo, dangling precipitously over his head. This scene Man Ray overlaid with a superimposed nude, still anonymous in fact, we don't know who she is, thus providing Tzara's debut portrait in Paris the erotic spin appropriate to Man Ray's own interests at the time. Did such an image have the implications of a memento mori, photographic iterations of time equals death and so on? Certainly. But time via the alarm clock is of course not just a model of biological time, a chronos of melancholy. The collectivist nature of this Dadaist symbol likewise reveals other valences. Picabia, for instance, equated his symbolic action in Zurich with the very heart of Dadaist aesthetics, dedicating one of his mechanical portraits to Dada historicizing. There he showed the names of various members of International Dada, composing the hours on a clock face, connected to an alarm mechanism bearing the words New York and Paris, with the name Picabia hovering directly beneath. This industrial strength alarm system is depicted by Picabia as engaged in the very act of ringing. Notice the little hammer here. No doubt very loudly in proper Brutus fashion, reveals something of the emblematic nature of Picabia's act for the Dada movement in my mind. If Picabia destroys workaday, Taylorist time in his act of smashing the hotel clock, and I don't know about some of you, but I thought about smashing my alarm clock this morning, what with my jet lag, he nevertheless recreates the agitated state of a call to arms. The Dada destruction of clock time, the time of labor, and of routine schedules, results in an alternate consciousness of the Dada period as an ephemeral state of emergency in which figures across the globe are bound together in this moment of awakening and uprising. Now, in previous research, I have explored the ongoing leitmotif of the image of the alarm clock and the clock in general, both in Dada and Surrealism. But for today's presentation, I decided to explore a new facet of the significant iconography of the clock during the 1920s. Hans Richter's film Vormittagsspuk, or Ghost Before Breakfast, as he translated it, made in 1927 and first screened before the public in Germany in 1928. As I had discovered, the image of the pesky alarm clock with its impudent ringing has peppered Dada and Surrealist visual and textual works with figures such as Walter Benjamin, André Breton, Jacques Vacher, Man Ray, Fernand Léger, among several others, all weighing in to comment on the status of this modernist theme. In my mind, there is still, therefore, something of an allegorical nature to both Surrealism and Dada in this early 20th century period, in the way in which the image of an everyday object such as the clock or the alarm clock, and also, as we will see in the case of Richter's Vormittagsspuk, other kinds of iconic modern objects such as the bowler hat, the revolver, the target, the paper collar, and the necktie become symbols of much larger themes for the expression of the zeitgeist. Here then, the historian of these avant-gardes must be careful to distinguish between studies in material culture and popular culture as ends in themselves, from the study of such everyday items as coded metaphors for broader theoretical ideas having to do with subject-object relations, societal power structures, and agonistic struggles in the realms of politics and philosophy. How then can we understand this articulation of time in Richte's 9-minute film Vormittagsspuk, about which very little scholarship has been written? This dearth of scholarship has not been ameliorated even in the recent flourishing of Richte scholarship as a result of Timothy Benson's wonderful and comprehensive exhibition of Richte's work at the Los Angeles Museum of Contemporary Art in the spring and summer of 2013. Did anybody get to see that show in LA? I didn't either. I was very sad not to be able to see it. So there's a new exhibition catalog. Time is clearly a central theme in this important avant-garde film, and yet interpretation is perhaps complicated from the outset due to the film's relationship to both Dada and Surrealism. Now, Richter is well known as a participant in both Zurich and Berlin Dada, and he made some of the first Dada films with his friends Viking Egeling in the early 1920s. And yet by 1927, the year in which Vormittagsspuk was filmed, Dada had long since been transmuted and diffused through the debut of international surrealism, the Bauhaus, and other avant-garde developments. In addition to this chronological factor affecting classification, Richter was a close friend of Man Ray's and had spent extended time with him in Paris in 1925, just after the launching of the Surrealist movement. So Richter was well informed about Surrealism. As I will argue here, Vormittagsspuk is heavily influenced by Man Ray's aesthetic, and in particular his early Surrealist film Imak Bakia of 1926. Several other facts also relate the film that Richter himself translated as Ghosts Before Breakfast into English, closely to Surrealism as a movement, but also to a Surrealist aesthetic at large. A consultation of writings and interviews by Richter, however, reveals that he was ambivalent about the classification of the film by artistic movement, Dada or Surrealism. At times he calls the film Surrealist, and at others he refers to Vormittagsspuk as Dada. It's actually quite bewildering if you look at his texts. It's notable that in one important text, a book by Richter completed at the end of 1939, but not published until the 1970s, a book with an interesting title, The Struggle for the Film Towards a Socially Responsible Cinema. Richter classes Vormittagsspuk with Picabier's 1924 film Entr'acte as a surrealist film. He likewise discusses Vormittagsspuk in conjunction with his own enthusiasm for surrealist hero Georges Méliès, with whom Richter proposed a film collaboration shortly before Méliès' death, as well as broader aesthetics of the fantastic and the grotesque. So I think it's quite interesting that, unfortunately, Méliès died, but Richter was wanting to enter a more surrealist vein with his cinema from very early on, I argue. So my thesis about Richter's Ghosts Before Breakfast, which I think is more exactly translated as Spooks in the Morning, is that the film evinces a major shift in avant-garde attitudes toward time, namely from a Dadaist attitude of the need for human agency to disrupt and obliterate imposed societal models of time, to a broadly surrealist notion of time as something that reigns over human agency and instead causes havoc as a result. This thesis is essentially an argument about subject-object relations and the question of the reification of individuals under a capitalist system of valued time. It is also an argument about the shift from the Dada practice of the ready-made as a passive entity that is manipulated to an enigmatic surrealist found object, which is implied as having some sort of agency beyond the maker. I would like to use the contrasted examples of Picabier's 1919 Action in Zurich and Hans Richter's Vormittagsspuk as a microcosmic expression of larger opposites I see between Dadaism and Surrealism as a whole in the decade following the conclusion of World War I. Both of these expressions of time are profoundly influenced by the traumatic experience of the Great War, of course, as well as contemporary doctrines of anarchism and historical materialist Marxism. And just so you know, Richter was very influenced by anarchism, as well as the Surrealists. Now, ultimately, I view the Dada approach to temporarily, and here I am generalizing greatly for the sake of the comparison, as a prefiguration of a Surrealist position. In addition, I chose Richter's film as an exemplum of Surrealist time for today's presentation because I view Surrealist models of time as overarchingly cinematic in themselves, That is, the elasticity of temporalities allowed for in cinema, and specifically trick cinema, I argue, not just montage, but trick cinema, illusions, arguably permitted the fullest expression of a fully nonlinear, non-progressive, and scrambled temporality that echoes the dynamic surrealist approach to its own contemporaneity. If one is familiar with Richter's first film experiments with Viking Egeling in the early 1920s, this is very hard to see, the various examples of the Rhythmus series, then it is somewhat easier to understand what a drastic shift the figurative and semi-narrative Vormittagsspuk was for Richter in 1927. Always identifying himself as a painter, first and foremost, Egeling and Richter collaborated on the Rhythmus films in Berlin as a result of their collaborative work on the abstract scrolls they both created between roughly 1919 and 1923. And this is one of the scrolls. This is not a film still. Certainly in these abstract scrolls and the Rhythmus films, both Richter and Egeling are interested in the concept of time as a kind of musical rhythm, which spurs a causal reaction of part and counterpart in geometric forms. So developmental, I think, as you can see here. Now for Richter, the time movement element of cinematic film allowed for the developmental structure he sought in the scrolls as teleological matrices, building toward an end, that manifested a certain kind of formal syntax, almost like the ideographic languages that he and Egeling eagerly studied in this period, in particular Chinese. Movement in time was something that for these two friends could not be achieved even through the experimental technique of panorama-style scrolls. Film was a last resort for the animate freedom of painting. By 1927, when composer Paul Hindemith approached Richter in Berlin about the prospects of collaborating on a short film for a festival in Baden-Baden, Richter had recently begun his professional career as a commercial filmmaker, something that's only recently being addressed in the scholarship on him, completing 2 such productions in the years just before Vormittagsspuk. Richter's earliest commercial work had a documentary and educational thrust, and I do believe this also impacted the crisp cinematography and athletic editing of Vormittagsspuk, which itself was a project that was funded by Richter's commercial enterprises. In addition, Richter's 4-minute film Studie of 1926, of which this is a still, with its sequences of non-objective footage, served as an intermediary between the abstract Rhythmus films and Vormittagsspuk. In particular, the montage of eyeballs, you can see here, in Film Studie bears the mark of Man Ray's films up to that point in time, and Richter himself called this work a surrealist study. Okay, now I'm going to start the film, so I'll be speaking while it's playing. I'll be a little bit out of sync with it, but hopefully that disorientation will be appropriate. In addition, as I have also mentioned, Richter's exposure to the surrealist films and artwork of Man Ray proved to be a major influence. Where other scholars such as Pervez and McFarland in the 2012 volume Hans Richter, Rhythm 21, have argued that Vormittagsspuk is instead a remnant of Richter's affiliation with Russian constructivism and the November Group, most clearly visible in his publication of the short-lived avant-garde journal G. I opine, on the contrary, that contact with Man Ray's surrealism is the primary catalyst for this shift in his cinema. Now, while I do acknowledge, following Marianne von Hoffacker and the 1998 book Hans Richter, Activism, Modernism, and the Avant-Garde, that the Neue Sehen, or new vision approaches spurred by the Bauhaus and its offshoots, were likewise a point of reference, and for Vormittagsspuk, in particular regarding his use of off-kilter camera angles. I nevertheless deem again that Imak Bakia, with its exploitation of trick cinema, is again more significant. For me, the decisive factor in this classification game is Richter's enthusiastic employment of stop-action filming in Vormittagsspuk, which you will see throughout the film. It's happening here, where the camera is stopped so that a hand can interfere with a shot and not be seen. This is also a technique that Man Ray exploits liberally in his films of the second half of the 1920s, and his friend Richter explores this method to grand effect in Vormittagsspuk. So back to the question of time. Ghost Before Breakfast famously commences, as you just saw, with the image of a white clock face rising like a moon in the black frame of the screen, with the minute and second hands seizing up and restarting again exactly at 10 o'clock, more like a stopwatch than an alarm clock. From that point in the film, the racing clock face haunts the progressive sequences and returns to transform the last frames of the film when the hour has reached 12 noon and the clock then splits in half, thus ending the implied 2-hour progression of the film between 10 and 12 o'clock. And one presumes also time itself having an ending of sorts. From the beginning, the film's first and only subtitle, appended in later decades by Richter, tells us that the film is bound up with the idea of political uprising, and that time has everything to do with this revolution. With the background of a clock face in negative, the subtitle that you read tells us that the only copy of the sound version of the film with the Hindemith score was destroyed by the Nazis after Richter fled to the United States in the late 1930s. And I quote here, the subtitle says, "It shows that even objects revolt against regimentation." In this slogan, regimented or structured time becomes a vise or prison for both objects and subjects, thus implying that ordered time must be overcome and possibly destroyed, following Picabbia's 1919 action with the alarm clock. And yet the scenario that Richter gives us is instead one in which time is not destroyed, but rather transformed into a new modality, in which normative roles of agency and power are subverted. The theme of a reversed time, or an upside-down time zone where everything is topsy-turvy, does seem to be the subject of Vormittagsspuk. And again, I argue that this topic reflects a more surrealist view of modern time as having its own agency, a kind of fluidity, which is often oppressive to individuals who become objectified as a result. So this is a kind of reversal. The clock commences ticking at 10 a.m. and thereafter lunges forward in time at 5-minute increments at a breakneck pace with the help of stop-motion editing. Immediately, the subsequent shots tell us that something unnatural is amiss. Objects have suddenly taken on animistic characteristics. Bowler hats are flying around in quadruple, cleverly evading their desperate owners, and dishes are smashed into the pavement in defiance of their service for morning tea or coffee. The young bourgeois man is apparently attempting to get ready for his day, presumably a work day given his beleaguered appearance, and yet his cravat and reusable disposable collar engage in their own gleeful courtship dance. The clock face then reappears in the guise of a shooting target, and a man pulls a revolver out of his coat. And I'd like us just to remember here that, of course, the revolver is an important surrealist emblem appearing in Breton's manifesto, but also the target was an important surrealist emblem, I think. If you notice in the pictures of the Central Surrealiste in 1924, they actually have a shooting target in the room there. I think these are influenced by Picabbia's paintings just before that time as well. They have some targets in them. Another subject matter. The strictures of time have resulted in a desire for violence, the destruction, once again, of the ubiquitous alarm clock. However, this organization of space and time in the guise of the target fools the shooter. The man can't kill the opponent with a bouncing head. The movement is too erratic. Here, the revolving clock has quelled the revolution of the reified subject. So I'm equating here the revolution of the clock's arms to revolution of time and being. Once the clock reaches 12 for the first time in the film sequence, the young man, perhaps what we might call a protagonist, helplessly splits in two. As opposed to Picabbia's smashed alarm clock then, Richter's Vormittagsspuk displays the unraveling of subjectivity and the reification of the individual under the pressure of various simultaneous modalities of time. Workaday time, conventional times of social habit, biological time as you have just seen, and historical time. Now, for the remainder of this twilight zone, the clock time of reification retains victory over the human subjects who seek in unison to regain control, desperately, right? The bowler hats turn the men's chase into a slapstick comedy, fire hoses ravel and unravel in licentious cahoots with the bowler hats, etc. When linear time becomes fully unchained in the middle of Vormittagsspuk, the hats begin to morph into other objects, and we gain a kind of surrealist association, more closely associated with films like The Seashell and The Clergyman by Germain Dulac. Time-lapse filming permits the accelerated growth, of plants before the naked eye, and natural time thus appears as the in the film as well, overcome by this kind of social time. Now, most interesting to me is the outlandish sequence when the historical time is evoked and combined with these bearded men, who gradually modernize and become younger, losing their beards, and subsequently are interspersed with four colonial men facing away from the camera, who eventually lose their wigs in the historical flow of time. The violence that subsequently breaks out with this unraveling of time modalities is, I think, something important to consider in contrast with Picabia. So I argue that instead of the clock breaking up, for Richter, it is the human body that breaks up. Again, this question of human agency, time overcoming the power of human agency. So I'm going to conclude with this last paragraph so that we can see the end of the film here. In my opinion, the key to a deeper understanding of this surrealist cinematic version of time has to do with the method of stop action and the reversal of subject-object roles it allowed in such a visceral fashion for the first time in the art of cinema. So on top of montage, which is well considered in modernism, I think stop action and other tricks must be revisited by scholars to think about time. Surely Richter took inspiration from Man Ray's 1926 poem Imakbakia, as I have mentioned, but also I think that there is a separate dream world of chance that occurs when these spooks appear before the midday meal in Richter's film here. As a regressive form of causality, animism, the animism of the objects, suggests quite clearly that multiple, competing temporalities exist in the same experiential framework. How can future assessments of surrealism more clearly express this alternate realm of object time? I argue that we can commence by more closely studying these illusionistic effects of cinema at the time. So I'll conclude here and we can let it keep playing. It's just about to finish as we switch our speakers here. Thank you very much.